Fantastic. So welcome everybody to our May Journal Club session. This is a special event actually, where we will be launching some of the resources that our most recent tour of duty, the evidence checklist team, developed over the last few months. I want to do a couple of things before we dive in. The project lead and the lead author for this manuscript is going to take us through a little bit of the backstory, highlight some of the resources for us. And then several of the co-creators who are on the line today are going to give you their own insights into how they are going to use this tool, the problem that it solves for, and sort of our combined hopes for how we can raise the bar around the quality of reporting as we evaluate these digital tools. Before we do that, none of this kind of work happens without an extraordinary amount of hard work from colleagues behind the scenes. And I'm actually going to refer to a list here because it's really important that I get everyone. And this was a diverse and thriving team. And I want to thank, first of all, the authors of the evidence checklist, the project lead and the lead author, Christine Manta, Nikhil Mandaheva, Jesse Becker, Simel Ermak, Elena Ismailova, Natalie Park, Jiat Lin Poon, Santosh Shavade, Sarah Valentine, Ben Vanden Riesch, Courtney Webster, and it was an honor for me to run behind this team as they forged ahead. I also want to thank and some other collaborators who aren't co-authors on the manuscript, but made critically important contributions to this project. But Beth Konkowski is on the line, will be providing some commentary today. She, as always, with so much of our work at Dime, was a very gracious sort of participant in this, gave us really thoughtful feedback, asked hard questions as we went forward, and ultimately made sure that the quality of this work was as good as it could be. So Beth, thank you, and I'm delighted you're joining us today. I also want to thank Joe Caveda and Ray Dorsey. They are the editors-in-chief of NPJ Digital Medicine and Digital Biomarkers, respectively. When you build a publication checklist, you have to be in conversation with your end users, and that includes the journal editors. We are very, very lucky that both Joe and Ray made such meaningful and thoughtful contributions to this. And Ray has actually joined us today to provide a little bit of color and insight from the editor's perspective, as well as a physician scientist and expert in digital health. So we really do have a terrific lineup for you today. Let's dive in and do some housekeeping. For folks who may not have attended a journal club before, let me tell you a little bit about how we run these sessions. So first of all, for full disclosure, we are recording today's session, and this recording will be posted to our website within the next 24 hours or so. The way we will structure today's conversation, Christine as lead is going to walk us through the work that we did with the evidence checklist. I then have the privilege of hosting a bit of a panel discussion with the co-creators and our guests, Beth and Ray, and then we throw it open to questions from you. The way we field those questions is sort of as much as possible through a discussion. So when it comes time to do that, please feel free to turn your video on. Also, please don't feel any pressure. You can raise your hand, not like this, but using the reactions in the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom. We can call on you to ask your questions live. If you're somewhere where you can't chat, you're obviously very welcome to pop those questions into the written chat, and I will give those voice and make sure that our experts on the line take the time to answer your questions today. So again, welcome everyone to our May Journal Club. Thank you again to all of the team behind Evidence for the support of digital biomarkers and getting this out into the world, for Ray and Joe's support as editors helping us through this process. And with that, Christine, let me hand over to you to introduce yourself in a little bit more detail and walk us through the work we did together on evidence.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. So I'm Christine. I'm head of the Applied Sciences team at Electra, where I lead work on our Atlas platform to support the evaluation and deployment of connected sensors for at-home measurements. My background is in research out of academic institutions and hospital systems. Prior to Electra, I was at CITI, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, developing a database of feasibility studies evaluating mobile technologies. So I want to thank everyone for joining today. Thank my co-authors for their work on this really outstanding piece of evidence, the evidence checklist. I'm excited to share more about it. Ready for the next slide. So with the evidence checklist, our goal was to address this problem. Quality of reporting and peer-reviewed literature evaluating digital measurement products is highly variable. Over the past couple years in my roles at Electra and Dime and at Citi, I've read hundreds, like if not thousands of peer-reviewed papers and abstracts that have used a connected sensor. My co-authors are in the same boat, and anyone who's in attendance today who has conducted a literature review for their own research, who served as a reviewer for an academic journal, or someone who just reads the latest publications to stay informed is probably aware of how variable it can be and how these problems can really create great challenges. So next slide. So a major hurdle of the variability is that inconsistencies in essential metadata and variances in evaluation protocols can lead to low confidence in the results and researchers unnecessarily repeating work. And this is really inefficient, expensive, and in some cases can even be unethical. So next slide. And this work was originally highlighted by what we did at Citi, which was a systematic review of studies evaluating mobile technologies use in clinical research. And for this systematic review, they found some interesting findings through the over 200 papers that we've read, and that only 73% of those studies reported the software that they used in analysis. Nearly 10% didn't report the make and model of the technology used, and there was a lot of variation in how the sensor modalities were described. And these all impact the ability of a researcher to replicate that work and really be able to interpret what was going on in that study. So next slide. To speed the development and the deployment of digital measurement products that are worthy of our trust, the quality of reporting must be improved. So next slide, enter the evidence checklist. So the evidence checklist is a 25-item checklist that covers universal requirements for best practices. So these are things that everyone on the line is probably familiar with, right? Study objectives, sample size, limitations, conclusions. But we also included some unique considerations for reporting on connected sensors and software, and I'll highlight those in the next slide. So the checklist was, you can go back for a quick second, sorry. The checklist was developed by the group of experts on the line. We did some virtual workshops, we did some rounds of asynchronous feedback. People put in a lot of time and effort to go back and forth on what should be in and what should be out. And to align with broadly accepted research standards, we did structure the checklist similar to Prisma and Consort and START and Strobe, which are other publication checklists out there. So hopefully the format is already familiar to a lot of people. All right, next slide. So these are some of the unique checklist items that we wanted to include for connected sensors and software. And the goal here is really to establish some ground rules for what metadata should be included in publications to make it easier for those reading those papers trying to make decisions on what digital tools are really out there, which ones have solid evaluation evidence for them, so that they can just make decisions using those studies rather than repeating that work. These items are important because of the variability in the specifications that does exist, and the potential time lag between when the study is conducted and then how long it takes to get it published. The technology rapidly improves over that time lag. So including some of these areas will allow your readers to be able to evaluate whether that study is still relevant, years after it happens. So we're building a really strong evidence base. Next slide. Cool. So there are 5 types of evaluation studies that are in scope to be used with the evidence checklist. And another goal of evidence is to promote V3 proof of concept studies and utility and usability studies as being the core types of evaluations that researchers should really be honing in on. So this is a table from the manuscript that you can check out and take a look at to see the definitions of each. And I'm really excited about the checklist as well, because it clearly says what you need to be a strong verification study, to be a strong analytical validation study, to be a strong clinical validation study. So I think we're really nicely building on the great work that was done with the V3 framework, which I'm thrilled about. Next slide. Yeah, so just as important as in scope is what's out of scope. And we spent a lot of time talking about this during the workshop. So I wanted to highlight it in a slide here, that evidence is not meant for e-pros or therapeutics or some of the medication adherence tools. So this is here as a reference. And then next slide. To be able to determine what's in or out, this was harder to do than you would think. So we made this decision tool, which is available on the DIME website, so that you can walk through and ask yourself these questions to see if evidence applies to your study or not. And if evidence doesn't apply, we've hopefully given you some strong resources that you can go into and check it out to see, what might apply or how you can adjust your study so that it does meet one of the evaluation study criteria. And then last slide, highlighting some of our resources. So there's a new evidence webpage on the DIME website. And as with any DIME project, we love to engage the broader community. So if you're a journal editor interested in endorsing evidence for your publication, you can get in touch with us. If you end up using evidence to publish a study, and we hope you do, please contact us and we can share it. And any comments or suggestions for the checklist. If there's an item that you don't agree with, or you think some of the language should be tweaked, let us know. Where this should be a useful resource for the community at large. And the full manuscript is published in digital biomarkers, and the decision tool and a downloadable version of the checklist to be used in your publications is also available on the DIME website. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jen to talk to our co-authors.
Fantastic. Thanks, Christine, and thanks for your patience. I spent enough time advancing slides. I should be a bit better at it by now. So thank you, everyone. Christine, before I dive into a conversation with the rest of the authors, you said something really powerful that I think about often around, not only is sort of repeating these studies something that's, frustrating probably for the original researchers, for the researchers or the users who need to repeat the study. You also mentioned that we could even consider it to be unethical. Do you want to give that a little bit of voice quickly? Because I think it's something we don't articulate often enough, and I'd love for you to just give it a minute or two if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, of course. And curious for the rest of the group too to build on it as well. I think from doing research studies myself, to enroll a patient in a study, to expect them to wear that technology for a certain amount of time, to adjust maybe their schedules to be incorporated into this study, well, whether it's remote monitoring or not, you're still asking something of that patient population. If those results then can't be used, then you're adding to the burden down the line. So if we're doing a study, in 2021, and then we just do the same study in 2023, that's not helping that patient population. We want to be able to build on the research. So that's where I think it becomes unethical if it's adding extra patient burden that we could have solved for, previously.
Fantastic, Christine. That was really nicely articulated. And I'm going to pose a couple of questions to the co-creators of the evidence checklist, to some of our guests. While I'm doing that, folks on the line, please feel free to use the chat to drop in your questions. I'll make sure we get to them before we break. Elena, I'd love to start with you. First of all, you've been part of DIME since the start. You're one of the co-founders on the Strategic Advisory Board, had a wonderful tenure with Jesse Backer chairing the research committee. You were also one of the co-authors on the V3 manuscript. And, how does the work we've done here on the evidence checklist sort of build on that work? How does it help make that more action-oriented? If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and then giving voice to that question, that would be great. And thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Jen. I'm happy to present here and join the crew in this really important endeavor. My name is Elena Izmailova. I'm Chief Scientific Officer of Connexa Health, a company that provides a platform for digital device integration and electronic patient diaries. It is a device agnostic platform and doing the study in a correct way and reporting them accurately, it's core to our business. In addition, of course, to my role in DIME, which I'm really proud of this organization. So this work builds on the foundation laid out by the V3 framework. I will stop here for a few minutes and talk about the V3 framework itself. This was one of the DIME flagship publications. To my knowledge, it was the first publication by DIME. The paper was written in 2019, very soon after DIME became an organization itself and opened membership to everyone who is interested, and it was published in early 2020. What this publication did, it filled a huge gap in the field, providing guidance which experiments are needed if a researcher has a certain technology, a sensor with accompanying algorithm, and wants to decide if this sensor and algorithm are good enough for the work they are doing. V3 stands, as Christine explained, for verification, comparing of sensor performance to a bench standard. It's an in vitro experiment. Analytical validation, assessing the accuracy of algorithm reporting that is processing the sensor data in human subjects. It can be done in normal healthy volunteers or disease. And the third V stands for clinical validation, establishing a relationship between the sensor and algorithm output with a clinical concept of interest it's capturing and understanding how strong this relationship is. This was very much needed because there was no guidance in the field when we started this work, how actually to design these experiments. And we're really proud that this work continues to be adopted by researchers in the field. People references, it's highly cited papers, and it's been mentioned by regulators, including EMA. The problem is that the next step is to understand how much data, results, and evaluations are out there according to the V3 framework. Christine did a very extensive explanation of challenges that the field develops and variability of data reporting that leads to replication and often unnecessary replication of the existing experiments because the reporting is patchy sometimes, that forces people to replicate the experiment that has been already done because of insufficient reporting. We sincerely hope that the evidence will help the scientific community to improve on their work, increase consistency of the reporting, and promote future research. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions.
Elena, that was fantastic. And I really like the way you sort of talked about, the evidence checklist really being the next step in sort of supporting folks who want to implement V3, actually get the terrific work they do out into the world in the most valuable format. So thank you so much. And thanks for being part of this. Sarah, I'd love to come to you next. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to everyone, and then tell us a little bit about how sort of you hope the evidence checklist is going to affect how you do technology selection and how you conduct research in your role at Lilly.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate the opportunity to join everyone today. My name is Sarah Valentine. I am a digital implementation lead at Eli Lilly in our emerging digital medicine team within the medicines development, information and digital solutions space. That's a mouthful. It's a very long-winded way of saying I work directly with our study teams in order to help them design, deliver, and support what we call digital implementations in their clinical trials. So we work across a number of different therapeutic areas and indications with all kinds of trials, from exploratory and POC studies to analytical and clinical validation studies in order to implement technologies like sensors, wearables, novel research applications, and software as a medical device, just to name a few. I think the development of the evidence resource will change the way that our team does work in a couple of different ways. First, I think by setting the standards for what good publications look like for the evaluation of sensor technologies, we can up our game when it comes to partnering with the right vendors and selecting the right technologies to implement in our research. So to date, we've leveraged several tools to enable this process, including some of the resources produced by this community. I think Elena had done a great job of introducing the V3 framework. We use those types of resources to assess publications technologies that we might use in our future studies. But what the evidence checklist does that's a little bit different is it helps us specifically identify key aspects within research that we review. It highlights things that we should consider and shines a spotlight on areas that we may need to dig a little deeper into, especially with considerations to the different study types that I mentioned previously. I think that used in concert with the guidance from the most recent playbook tour of duty will help us understand where technologies might best fit into our study-specific use cases. The second thing that I did want to call out is when we're considering how we might develop our own technologies in the future, I think that the evidence checklist can enable us to have way better conversations with our study teams on what trial design should look like in order to produce good research. Lilly has been making traditional drug medicine for close to 150 years. Relative to that, digital medicine is an extremely new space for us and something that we're really still wrapping our heads around. So I think by helping our teams understand the level of evidence that's required or preferred for any given study type, we can better plan ahead and almost reverse engineer. So if we know that something is needed, we can ensure that our study design accounts for that requirement. So those are just a few ways that I think the evidence checklist will change the way we do work. I think it'll be an instrumental resource for my team in the future, and very excited that it's finally out and available to the world.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks for being part of it. It's really exciting to hear actually how your Lilly team is already using some of the resources available. And it makes my heart happy to hear how, even, you're a co-creator of evidence, but even how you're able to sort of draw on those different resources and see the evidence checklist as it's intended to be a way to sort of draw it all together in a very sort of, distilled and action-oriented format. So thrilled that the resources are being so helpful, and really appreciate you giving us some insight onto how you're using these tools with your teams. Ben, I want to come to you next. So you are now co-chair of the research committee here at Dyne. Really grateful for your leadership and hard work there. You also wear a couple of hats out in your sort of in your day job. Tell us a little bit. We've talked a lot about the phenomenon of sort of research studies being repeated. Tell us a little bit about how much you see this happening, how this may be causing inefficiency. Really excited to learn from you on this.
Sure. So the idea that studies are being repeated, I think for everybody on the call here is not going to come as a surprise. That was the whole point of generating the evidence checklist in the first place. And from personal experience with especially interacting with both pharma and academic researchers, we see, or I see very often, that they do rely on literature to make decisions, which is a good thing. And hopefully with the work that the evidence checklist has done, we'll be able to move to a place where a lot of these studies are done in a more consistent way. Because again, from personal experience, what I often see is that there's a bit of a Me Too reflex where people want to repeat a certain pilot study because there is stuff out there in the field, but it's not really clear how it was done, and it's important to them. So another pilot study is set up, but that really doesn't help us to move forward as a field as a whole. So yeah, definitely, I from personal experience see a lot of studies being repeated, and so maybe to give one or two examples of that, or more practical examples. So one case, for instance, is when you think about algorithms that run on a biomet, it could be either on the device or run separately from it. There's typically 101 solutions already available to solve a particular problem. And when I say 101, that's probably in some cases still a bit conservative. So if you think, for instance, about something as simple as step counting, there's as many algorithms as there are proprietary devices. And on top of that, you have a huge collection of academic papers that try to solve the same thing. And if you want to grab one of these examples for your own work as a kind of a stepping stone, typically there's not enough public information available to jump immediately to clinical validation. So in many cases, people will be forced to reinvent the wheel there. So this is one example or one category of examples where I really hope that the evidence checklist will help to kind of standardize reporting and methodology so that people can really use the work from others as a stepping stone to move forward and not always reinvent the wheel again. And to maybe top that off with one other example that I've seen personally, is it kind of also goes both ways, not only on the level of the people generating the data and wanting to publish it, but also on the level of the journals and the publications itself. We've actually noticed on our end, on Bytefly's end, some resistance when you're trying to publish data that is a clear proof of concept or a pilot study, as it's defined in the evidence checklist now. So really aimed at getting preliminary information and to inform future studies, and also, and very critically important in my opinion, get initial utility and usability data in while you're still in a development stage where you can tweak parts of the application. That's critically important. And we've seen resistance when trying to publish that kind of information, that it's often seen as too preliminary and not something that the field wants to see. And I respectfully disagree with that opinion. And I hope that, maybe this is a bit aspirational, but I really hope that the evidence checklist will help create an environment where pilot studies are considered acceptable for publication, as long as, of course, that you properly stage them as such, so that the community can really use that information to keep building on each other's work and keep moving forward and avoid building these silos that have already popped up to some extent.
Ben, two terrific examples. I saw lots of wry smiles and sort of pained expressions as you were talking about sort of step count algorithms, and then lots of furious head nodding. I think you highlighted one of the things from the evidence checklist I'm most proud of, which is the categorization of different types of evaluation studies of digital measurement tools. You know, and as long as we're talking apples and oranges, we're not going to get much further. And I love that you sort of flagged that. Hopefully we can get on the same page. You know, what does it mean to do this kind of study, and what does good look like? You know, hopefully that evidence is now available to folks. Ben, I also didn't tee you up very well. Can you quickly introduce yourself to everyone? I should have asked you.
No, that's okay. I felt like jumping straight into the question. So hi, everyone. My name is Ben Andries. As Jen mentioned, at DIME, I'm currently one of the co-chairs of the research committee, taking over from Elena and Jesse, who ran the previous cycle, together with Isaac Rodriguez right now. In my day job, I am CMO at Bytefly. We're a company that builds both clinical applications as well as clinical trial applications that really build the devices, wearable devices, as well as cloud infrastructure algorithms to process all the data, and the apps around it tailored towards both healthcare professionals and patients. So really full vertical integration of digital health applications, not focused on general wellness or general health data collection, but really focused or tailored towards specific patient populations.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ben. Appreciate that. Simal, I want to come to you next. Well, we're talking about sort of specific applications. So you use in your work, you use digital tools specifically to measure sort of mental health. Tell us about sort of the landscape there. Tell us about your vision for sort of the evidence checklist impacting your field.
Perfect. And hi, everyone. I'm Shimal. I'm the CEO and co-founder of TB Health. We are an early stage health technology company helping expecting and new parents and their care providers to detect, predict, and prevent parental mental health disorders such as postpartum depression and anxiety. And it's a really great pleasure to be here today. And it was a super great pleasure to contribute to work on evidence, because all of these discussion and the way that, why we are all rooting for evidence is very crucial for us in terms of both for us to be able to rely on the research and as well as for us to be able to contribute on the field of science. And I will, expand on this a little bit. So currently we are building a digital diagnostic solution that can reliably diagnose the conditions that we are working on, which means that we are integrating a variety of types and forms of real world data. And we are trying to come up with a unique set of digital markers to reliably detect each condition. So, for us to be able to basically ignore the research, existing literature, and just do everything ourselves would be inefficient and unethical, as Kristen mentioned. And also, as a scientist and former academician, it would be also very irresponsible because that's not how science works. By doing the research studies and publishing results in a comparable manner, we all contribute together to build the science, refine the results, iterate, to expand and try to reach the big conclusions. So, we should be able to rely on the existing field of knowledge. But for us to be able to do that, especially as a small company with limited resources, that body of evidence has to be accurate, of high quality, and reproducible. And for us, the most critical thing, it has to come with appropriate amounts of metadata. And metadata is really, really crucial for us, especially since we are working on mental health. By even just providing someone an activity tracker or asking them to weigh themselves every day, you change the behavior, you change the mood. So if you do not have the appropriate information in terms of how the study was conducted, and this is, even one step further in terms of knowing all the details of how frequently the data was sampled, but in general, whether any training was provided, where times are documented or not appropriately, it is really hard for us to be able to draw conclusions to determine whether a piece of evidence we see is, relatable to our concern, or if we have to, repeat similar studies. So that's crucial in terms of us being able to rely on the data. On the flip side, it's super useful to have a checklist as evidence because we also want to contribute to this field of knowledge. And now we have this framework of a desired high quality peer-reviewed publication. And as Sarah mentioned, which we are currently doing is basically back engineering to design what we need at each step of our study. And that's incredible in terms of saving us time and resources for us, as well as for all the people that we are trying to help.
Shamal, that was such a terrific sort of summary of, the variety in different ways that hopefully the evidence checklist can support your work in mental health, which is so needed. I also, I will share whenever I talk to, someone who's sort of a marketing or a messaging or a comms person, they're always like, who's your audience? No, we don't just have one audience in the work we do. There's too much work to do. We have to be many things to many people. And one of the things I'm really enjoying about sort of the comments today, and I think we've hit the sweet spot with evidence is, it's for the folks doing the research today. It's for those reviewers trying to evaluate the research, as sort of Ben gave voice to. It's the folks trying to think about informing the right conversations, like Sarah said. It's the folks sort of coming back to sort of published research and being able to sort of reuse it in an ethical way, as Christine mentioned. I'm really proud of this. And, hopefully that's how we establish sort of an actual standard. So I'm really thrilled that you flagged that, Shamal. Natalie, I'd love to come to you next if we can. You work every day sort of thinking about evaluating digital technologies and trying to think about how much value they bring to sort of clinical care. Tell us a little bit about how, some of the challenges that you've experienced and also how you're hoping the evidence checklist is going to help.
Sure. So my name is Natalie Park. I'm a pharmacist with background in health economics and outcomes research, and I currently am at SEAL Institute for Health Innovation at Geisinger, which is an integrated delivery network, as their innovations evaluator. So you might, as you might have guessed from my title, I do a lot of vendor and technology assessments for our innovation initiatives, which certainly includes connected sensor technologies. And from the perspective of the organization that's actually trying to use these technologies in practice, it's important that we do our due diligence and assess the technologies that are being pitched to us. with any of these new sensor technologies, we always get questions from clinicians about analytical validation, because they want to make sure the technology we're using for the patients and to make clinical decisions are reliable. And clinical validation, utility, and usability studies are also a very high interest and something I pay attention to, particularly because we're in rural area and we have a lot of elderly population. So I want to know in what population the study was done and whether there are any specific characteristics leading to attrition. This can also help make decisions about the target population for the technology. So we're allocating system resources optimally and to increase the likelihood of success in the early days of technology adoption. So to me, relevant publications adhering to evidence checklists would be one way of signaling their commitment to rigorous standards and transparency. And as I've said, it would give us a lot of important information we need and confidence in the technology, and we evaluate and make decisions about how to use and implement these technologies in practice. So I'm very excited to have this tool, which would allow myself and my colleagues to assess technologies in a much more consistent way than we do now.
Natalie, fantastic. Really, we were thrilled to work with you on this checklist, and I'm sort of smiling again because I feel like you've given us yet another sort of use case for this, which is, as a way for sort of vendors and sort of manufacturers and distributors of these sort of, new products to really signal to potential clients, particularly on the healthcare side, that actually their product is a good sort of choice for your context of use for the needs of the patient population that you serve. So really hopeful that it sort of delivers everything that we hope it does to your work, Natalie. And thanks again for being part of the checklist development. Santosh, I want to come to you next, if we can. And, you consult in sort of on the clinical research side, obviously spend a lot of time advising folks on how to think about the value of these technologies. Sort of tell us a little bit about how you can see the evidence checklist being applied. And I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here, if you're willing. Something else that you are championing within the research community here at DIME is thinking about sort of low resource settings and how we can use those technologies there. Curious to think about how the checklist might help either scope a body of future work or even be applicable today.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Jen. So hi, everyone. I'm Santosh. I'm based in Mumbai, India. As Jen mentioned, I consult with pharma and other partners on healthcare innovation, implementation, and outcomes research. And that was my reason to get involved with evidence checklist. I've led and managed pharma R&D projects in Novartis and other pharma companies, and so continue to work with a lot of pharma devices sort of clients. I think evidence can help us in a couple of ways in these spheres, and I'll talk about the low resource setting question in a minute. But when it comes to pharma, we all know, and we have heard now from Sarah and others, that they are the biggest developers and also a lot of times partners for uptake of these connected sensor technologies, right? And so in those cases, I see evidence helping clinical trial teams, commercial teams, in their reviews of these studies. They can pick up a lot of specific components that I think will be tremendously helpful from not only from strategy perspective, but also from operationalizing details at the ground level. So for example, if you see the paper, we have developed them into sections. And so for example, if you take the method section, we have gone into nuanced details about explaining, say, for example, the reference standards, which would be helpful for a lot of people to select the right one and to look at the right one in the publication and how that was and why that was used if people adopt evidence. So these kind of super practical things is something that would be really useful, I guess, for pharma, for people who are interested in looking at this literature and then picking it up. And so an extension of that would be to also start seeing better adoption of the checklist itself, which would then drive future research, future studies, help drive better protocol framing, better acceptance of standards, and so on and so forth. So of course, those are sort of long-term kind of thoughts. but we definitely feel that that would be something that would be useful. And all of these things, of course, would drive this low resource setting kind of research, especially once again, thinking about the operationalization stuff. So there is one parameter about staff training, team training, that's often kind of neglected, but we have seen, and we have given these examples in the paper once again, where these can play a lot of role, sometimes make or break kind of role in evaluation of the sensor technology. And that kind of evidence gathering would be super practical once again for low resource settings.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Santosh. And, I think that, my hope is not only that we achieve sort of everything we hope to in settings where we're already considering or actively sort of, engaging with these technologies, but that we can really get it right out of the gates when we think about translating these tools into low resource settings. So really appreciate your comments and delighted that you were part of this, Santosh. Beth, I want to come to you next if we can. You were very gracious in sort of advising us through the work on evidence. Really curious to hear from you a little bit about sort of your thoughts on the process, and also, and perhaps more importantly, all of this is driving towards the sort of development and publication of high quality evidence. How do you, obviously you sit at FDA, how do you think about sort of high quality evidence? How do you think about documenting that evidence in order to build trust across all stakeholders? Would love to hear some thoughts from you, and thanks again for being part of this.
Thank you, Jen. My name is Beth Kinkuski. I work at FDA in CDER's Office of Medical Policy. As Jen mentioned, I've provided kind of a background role and consulted periodically during the development of the paper. I am very excited about the evidence checklist. Having trust in digital health technologies is crucial to their success in the regulatory environment. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act set the evidence standard. For drug approval, substantial evidence of effectiveness is required, consisting of adequate and well-controlled investigations from which experts could conclude that the drug would have the effect described in the labeling. The evidence checklist sets the stage to publish the valid scientific evidence from a DHT. The checklist is a methodical way of making sure we're all talking the same language. What's the technology? What's the software algorithm? What reference standard was used? How were people trained? Did you evaluate usability? What adverse events did you see? What were your results? What were your conclusions? This is all the same information the FDA will want to see when you discuss using a DHT with us. The evidence checklist will be a consistent level playing field so everyone is on the same page when it comes to DHTs. As DHTs are explored in more and more therapeutic areas, we need to be able to rely on published literature to understand the functions and possibilities of these technologies. The more data and information we have, then we will be able to further understand what the data means, how it's clinically meaningful to patients, and how it can be used to develop novel endpoints for drug development. Designing a clinical investigation around a DHT is daunting. You have an investigational drug or device that you want to study in a new way that really hasn't been done before. With the DHT, you have the ability to collect so much data all of the time, but then it takes a lot of work and planning to make sure you're going about it in the appropriate way. I believe the evidence checklist is a great tool to build trust in DHTs through the collection and documentation of high quality evidence, which will in turn facilitate drug development.
Fantastic. Beth, I love the quote from the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, and it's actually really tremendous to sort of hear that articulated. We all instinctively know it. I don't refer back to it as often as I should, but, instinctively we know that there needs to be high quality evidence, and it's sort of really terrific to make that crosswalk. I'm a bit embarrassed that we've got this far in the conversation and I didn't state the obvious, which is it's about the data, right? And especially like the scope of evidence is, digital measurement tools, right? So it's all about, obviously we want it to be a product that our target users, whether that's the clinical colleagues we're asking to interact with them, the patients and people we're asking to use and wear them, but it's about the data. And I'm really glad that you sort of reminded us of that and sort of come full circle as we move through our discussion. And Beth, thanks for being part of this, and excited to, really all be working together with shared responsibility to make sure we are generating that high quality evidence that we need in order to keep people safe. So thanks, Beth, for being part of this.
Absolutely.
Ray, we were really proud to publish this in Digital Biomarkers. You're the editor-in-chief over there, as well as a prolific sort of physician scientist and very sort of precocious in the world of digital health. Tell us a little bit about sort of how, through a couple, you know, wearing a variety of your hats, first of all, how you hope the checklist might make sort of the peer review process I don't want to say easy because it never is, but perhaps a little bit more sort of efficient, and also how perhaps you and your colleagues may be able to use this in some of your research in urology.
Thanks very much, Jen. First of all, this is beautiful work done by Jen, Christine, and all the great co-authors that you've heard from. The work is outstanding. Digital Biomarkers are really proud to have published this. If you haven't seen the publication, it's online right now, and it's filled, you know, 25 items, but it's got great examples for each one of the items. And then the last thing before I answer your question about how it can be useful is I think one way it can be useful is that people get feedback. So checklists shouldn't be seen as written in stone, and I think Jen and Christine view that as such. If you have suggestions on what makes it better or worse, let Christine or Jen know, or let me know, and we'll communicate that back to them. People have identified a lot of things about data. To make data comparable across studies, it needs to be standardized. And this checklist provides a nice way to standardize the reporting of results, so you can make comparisons of research studies from one study against another, one device against another. It's also a great tool for authors. So if you're writing a paper and hopefully submitting it to Digital Biomarkers, this is a great way to make sure you're including all the relevant pieces of information. These similar checklists like Consort and others are been invaluable for reporting randomized controlled trials or observational studies. And I suspect that evidence will be invaluable in terms of reporting studies of digital tools. I'll stop there and see what Jen has for a follow-up.
Ray, you did two things there really nicely for us, and it wasn't even a plant. So first of all, yes, call to action, not only use this as you are thinking about not just writing up your study, but when you're planning your study, evaluating these tools and sort of reference it, cite it as you're submitting. But Ray, as you said, you know, these things shouldn't be static, right? The reason I think that the first version of the checklist out of the gates was so strong was because of the expertise of everyone you've heard from today, plus a couple of other folks. You know, and in fact, a really nice, easy way to provide feedback is there's actually a form. If you go to the webpage for evidence on the DIME website, there's a form there, and all of the other ways Ray said as well, either going directly to the journal or to Christine or myself, but definitely there are feedback loops available, and we are sort of excited to use them. I can see, so actually before we dive into questions from the audience, I just want to thank everyone on the line, all of the co-authors, Ray, Beth. We also have Courtney and Jessie on the line, who were our co-authors. They were really important to this. Jessie was also the former co-chair of DIME's research committee. They joined a bit late, so they weren't part of the official discussion, but wanted to make sure I recognize you two as experts and co-creators. Jordan, really terrific sort of question from you in the chat. Are you somewhere where you can unmute yourself and pose it live?
Hey, Jen. Yeah, great work, and great to be with you all today. So was wondering about addressing race and ethnicity in digital health measurement studies. And of course, measurement tools, digital or otherwise, don't necessarily work in the same way across racial and ethnic groups, which can be a big deal for equity and in digital health. And so I was curious if that was explored, not just you know, by addressing the standard like demographics reporting that might go in a table 1, but really understanding you know, from subgroup analyses that are pre-specified whether or not the measurement method performs comparably across groups. Would be great to get some feedback from the authors on that issue.
I can start and then see if others have follow-ups. So what was really challenging about picking some of the items that we included in the checklist is we'd try to include everything in there, and then we had to like pull things back to not be incredibly prescriptive about the like details within the items. I think, so to answer your question, we didn't include this like very specifically subgroup analysis in there, but I think it's a great point to consider, and I think could be relevant for specific measurements or specific technologies, like if you're using a PPG, for instance. And I think this is a little bit related to the reference standards. People also wanted us to say exactly which reference standard should be used for a specific measurement, and we couldn't get into that level of detail. It's just so varied. But I do think it's a good point to maybe there's like subcategories once we get in there where these things are more or less important depending on the measurement and the tech that's used.
I'd like to pile on there if I can, and definitely want to hear from our other co-authors. Jordan, you know me, strong opinions, but loosely held. So I'm going to say some things, and I want you and everyone else on the line to beat up on them if they're not correct. So, you know, to me, one of the critically important parts of analytical validation is to make sure that the performance of the algorithm that you are using is we're not just looking at the mean, we're looking at the variance of that performance across every different sort of member of the population that you say is in scope for your study. So if we are saying any human, you know, with a particular condition, you know, we need to look at the diversity of that population, and that should be reflected in your analytical validation. And Christine gave the example of sort of, you know, the PPG sensors, whether that's sort of heart rate, whether that's, you know, we've seen actually as a result of COVID, some pretty frightening studies around the performance of sort of the finger pulse ox. You know, to me, I want to sort of stamp my foot a little bit and say, no, that just has to be a standard part of analytical validation. However, I really welcome feedback from folks. And, you know, maybe we have our first follow-up paper, right, to get into a little bit more detail on this. You know, maybe we do need to go to the point of subgroup analysis. I'm sort of so cross with the whole thing. I just want to hammer home, for heaven's sake, this has to be part of analytical validation. But sort of welcome thoughts from you, Jordan. Jesse, I also see that you turned your screen on. I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this. But Jordan, sort of an immediate reaction to that?
Yeah, I often kind of had the same initial impulse to say that, you know, this really should be part of our plan. But I also want to be sensitive to the fact that there are realities, right? When performing research, there are feasibility limitations. So, you know, I think that it might make sense for this to at least get a mention, not as an essential element, but maybe as a preferred element, right? What you don't want to do is that like a researcher cannot perform any study at all unless they can do it perfectly, right? But for cases where they're not able to actually get, for example, an adequate subgroup sample size, right, to do an appropriate analysis, it might be reasonable for that to go in a limitations section that draws attention to the fact that we really got to take extra steps to see if this thing that works well in one group also works well in another group. What do others think?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Jen, I would like to elaborate a little bit more on the example that Christine has provided and emphasize the importance of the evidence checklist. Because if we take the pulse oximetry example in the context of COVID, that there are reports in the literature that there is difference on device performance with people with different tones of the skins. The most important thing is to report which model of the pulse oximeter of the hardware and software was used, because not all pulse oximeters are created equal. And for some pulse oximeters, the problem may have been solved and reported, and some not. What's the most perplexing is the papers that don't provide the details, and people draw the blanket agreements that pulse oximetry is not inaccurate. The details are critical, and that's why we are having this conversation about the checklist. Hopefully, we won't have these discussions in the future because the details will be reported.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Can I just add to that? Hi, everyone. It's Jessie. I was on the move, but I'm back now and I'm on camera, but I've been listening. First of all, congratulations to the team. And on this particular topic, completely agree. To to this whole discussion. But building on what Elena just said around reporting the tool, it's surprising how often the participants are not described or in sufficient detail. As many of you are aware or involved in fact, we're working on another systematic review in DIME on a different topic. And there's an astronomical number of the papers don't describe the race or ethnicity of their participant sample, so let alone subgroups. And that stands even amongst those papers published in the US, where there are well-defined, standardized race and ethnicity categories. Many other countries have that as well, but it is a little harder to merge across countries. But yeah, so reporting of the tools, but describing the participants seems like a really basic 101.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I just wanted to mention, it's a really good point that Jordan's making. I would take it even, a step further, not just limited to race and ethnicity, but any other characteristic that could, compromise the accuracy of the tool. I think, especially if there's no already established like literature or knowledge about that, then I would absolutely expect more elaboration to that in the publications.
Natalie, Jessie, Elena, Christine, great comments, and I saw a thumbs up from Jordan. So Ray, fair warning, we have a bit of a habit here at DIME. I would put a small wager within the next month or two, maybe having a bit of a follow-up thought piece to the evidence checklist that comes in as a submission. Jordan, you may have we may try and rope you in on that one. Some great comments here. This is absolutely terrific. Again, I want to thank everyone on the line for sort of wanting to understand better the evidence checklist, wanting to take it forward into your work. I hope that everyone on the line today, our co-creators and our guests, have given you more than enough ways that this tool could be immediately useful, and just really grateful to all of our collaborators for being such an important part of this. So let me do a couple of things really quickly, and I'm going to let you all get away on time. I just want to once again flag and thank all of my colleagues and co-creators. All of the resources we've discussed today are up on the DIME website under the Tours of Duty section, the evidence checklist. I also want to highlight a couple of upcoming events in case you're interested. Our next webinar is going to be moderated by my colleague Smit Patel. We're going to be looking at the different ways that pharmacists actually engage in digital medicine. Aspen RX is a virtual first company that is, I hope I'm getting this right. It's almost sort of like a gig economy for pharmacists, and it's making a huge amount of difference to the way that individuals receive care and the way that we're able to leverage pharmacists, who are the second highest trained sort of clinicians, certainly in the US. We also have Gerald Finken, who is thinking about how we best use pharmacists, and in particular community pharmacists, as part of our research. So that's our next webinar. Our next journal club, David Shaywitz is going to join us. He just published a book review of 5 different AI books in the Wall Street Journal. Some of the conclusions and some of the pieces he was able to tease out based on different thinking about how we can position AI in healthcare is tremendous. So hope you can join us for that discussion. And with that, just thank you everyone for joining. Thank you again to the full team who co-created the evidence checklist. Really grateful for this team, another extraordinary piece of work and hopefully valuable to the field. Thanks everyone.